Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. Let's make a start. The beginning of the parsha. There's a very, very interesting medrash, in which is brought in the Toras Chaim brings a medrash from I think it's Pinnacle. The medrash says like this. The medrash says like this. Review them. There were three ancestors of Avraham Avinu, Yaakov. They all made a covenant, a bris, with the Amei Haaretz, the people of the land. And there I think it goes on to discuss Yitzchak and Yaakov. We're going to focus on Avraham. Says the medrash. Avraham koras bris in Amei Haaretz. Avraham made a bris, a covenant with the Amei Haaretz. K'sheniglo malachim elov, when the malachim appeared to him. Hayasava, last week's parasha, chain archei am haaretz. They were just they were archei am haaretz. They were guests of the am haaretz, of the people of the land. They were just regular. That's what he thought they were, right? Regular people. V'rotz likroso, and he ran towards them, as we know. V'rotz lasishlam suda gedola, and he wanted to make for them a great suda. Yeah? Beginning of Parshas Chayei. V'rotz lahovi ben bokar, and he ran to bring a ben bokar, a calf. Barach lefonov ben habokar, but the calf ran away and fled from Avraham Avinu. V'nichnas le'maras hamachpelah. You know this medrash? And entered the maras hamachpelah. V'nichnas acharov sham. This medrash? Yeah. And he ran after the calf. He saw Adam and Chava there. He saw what a wonderful existence they had there in maras hamachpelah. That's why he desired the maras hamachpelah lachuzas kover. And then the medrash goes on to describe how he had a conversation with the Bnei Yevus, the Yevusim, to buy from the Toras Machpelah, and the Gemara says the medrash says they weren't Yevusim, they were Chitzim, but because of the city Yevus, they were called Yevusim, and they didn't accept it. And it goes on to say that we know that Hashem is going to give you all these lands anyway. Make an oath with us that you won't inherit our city except through our will. And the Ir Yevus presumably was Yerushalayim. Anyway, eventually he bought, which obviously, as we know, was only conquered later on. He bought more. Lofty ideas, very simple level, right? How does Avraham Avinu merit Maras Machpelah? What brings him to Maras Machpelah? And the answer is that it's the mitzvah that he does. It's the mitzvah of Chesed that he does. The mitzvah and the fact that he is so desperate to go after the Malachim at the beginning of Parshas Chayei, and to the extent that when the calf runs away, he runs after it because he needs that calf for the mitzvah of Chesed. That's what enables him to actually acquire and achieve the level, right, in Ruchnius terms of Maras Machpelah, to come close to what Maras Machpelah is. And of course, what do we think of when we hear this medrash? Where do we have a similar parallel in the Torah? Moshe Rabbeinu, right? The whole medrash, it's the same idea, right? With the sheep. And that's how he gets to the snare, right? That's how he gets to the snare. How does he get to the snare? Because he's so concerned about the job, the task that he has, and the welfare of this sheep. Therefore, he sees the snare. There must be a link in that way. And if that's the case, then it's a very powerful representation of how the level and what we do in terms of what seems like mundane acts in this world can actually elevate us beyond anything else. And I think there's something we can take it further than this as well. There is a note in the Toras Chaim, as I've mentioned before, is a collection of kiddush of midrashim, all sorts of interesting midrashim. So he says like this. Where is it? Which one was it? 1 second. Not this one inside. Yeah, it says like this. It seems to be based. I think this is based on a Zohar that Rabbi Drumoy says. No one knew where Ma'aras Machpelah was and what it was until Avraham Avinu came along and he saw it. And he smelled the scent of Gan Eden. V'shoma kol and he heard. V'shoma kol Malachi Asharis Omrim Adam Rishon Kover Shom, and he heard the sound of Malachi Asharis who said, the angel said, Adam Rishon is buried here, and Avraham Yitzchak and Yaakov are prepared. The place is prepared for them. Muchonim yu l'mokom hazeh. Ra haner dolek v'yotze. He saw the candle burning and he left. And miyad ho'es l'tavosoi al hamokom hazeh. And then he always knew that was the place he wanted. And I saw brought down that there is all of this is represented very powerfully in the names as well. So where is Ma'aras Machpelah? Ma'aras Machpelah is in Chevron. Chevron comes from Russian chibur, to connect, because it's a place of connection. It's a place where there is a connection between Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, which is exactly what's being represented here. That's what Ma'aras Machpelah is. It's connecting. It's considered to be, the Medrash considers it the entrance way to Gan Eden, the doorway to Gan Eden. So therefore you have the Russian chibur, because it's the connection between this world and if you like Olam Haba in that way, however you understand Gan Eden, it's a different story of a different time. But you similarly have the idea of Machpelah is koful, is doubled, right? That's what it is. Same thing, right? It's the Shnei Olamos, right? It's the two worlds, right? The same idea. That's what Machpelah. I know there's lots of, there's many other explanations of Machpelah, as we know, the couples, the Zu, etc. But there is also this representation again of the marrying together of two elements, of two ideas. Avraham Avinu gets there because he's running after that calf. So that link between Parshas Chayei and Parshas Chayei, I think, is very powerful. Now the Malbim says another idea. He asks, why is it that the Torah goes to such length to tell us this? Why is it that the Torah goes to such length to talk about this whole episode of buying the Ma'aras Machpelah compared to everything that's been discussed in the previous parasha? It seems a rather mundane issue to go to great lengths. Says the Malbim, Avraham wanted to do this. He wanted to implant, and he says, belev amim, people generally, in mankind, a fundamental principle in the foundations of faith, any faith, it seems. Shehu ha'emuna b'hasharas hanefesh achar moves, the concept that the nefesh remains after death, that the soul, that death is not the end, that the soul remains. And the ultimate reward that will be both for the nefesh and for the guf. He says, he goes on to explain, we don't have to read all of it, he goes on to explain how those who are Yishenei Off or Yokutsu B'Yom Hadin, they will one day arise on the Yom Hadin Hagodol, V'asidim Tzadikim Sheyamdu B'Lvusheya, and they are going to they will one day arise in their B'Lvusheim HaGashmiyim Shelevushim Mechayeihem. They will arise in the same garments they were wearing when they were alive, and that's the whole idea of preparing the idea and the sensitivity towards where the mace is buried. He says all of this, the Malbim says, this was foreign to the Bnei Ches. The Bnei Ches, they thought that Kfura is just a temporary thing because of it's just unpleasant. We have to put the mace somewhere, otherwise, etc. What's going to happen, right? It's necessary. They didn't nothing to do with the future, and therefore, as a result of Avraham Avinu paying this amount of money for Ma'aras Machpelah, they came to understand what it means to have emunah, as he phrases it, b'hasharas hanefesh, to have a belief and a faith in the fact that the nefesh exists forevermore. Because it was only because Avraham Avinu had that emunah, they realized, would he be prepared to pay that amount of money in order to bury her in this place, and the sensitivity and the significance of this place. So what the Malbim does with this, I think, is he takes this whole first parsha in Chayei and turns it into a lesson, an object lesson in belief, in a fundamental aspect of emunah, right? The fact that there is a future, and that what it means that the nefesh survives and it doesn't, and they'll one day the tchias hameis, it's all contained within there. And he says that this is the concept also of Ma'aras Machpelah and the idea expressed in Chazal that it was biased for Aliyah al Gabov. That it was two stories. That's also Rashi, I think, brings that, right? There was a one story and there was another story on top, right? And the idea is, again, remez la'olam ha'elyon, the idea that there is an upper story in there is an upper story, and that is the idea. Shigam we learn from this parsha in terms of the last days of Avraham Avinu's life, the last stage of Avraham Avinu's life. I'm going to share with you several different ideas that the Mefarshim explain. No one, the Hamek Dover says, the Posuk Nesi Elokim Atov B'Seichenu. So on this, we're not going to only stay on the beginning, but this is at the beginning. Well, how do they address Avraham Avinu? They say to him, you are a Nesi Elokim, right? You are a Nesi Elokim, a prince of Hashem, a prince of Hashem. So it's an interesting phrase. It's an interesting phrase to use. Why are they calling him a Nasi, a prince? And what does it mean to Nasi Elokim? So says the Hamek Dover and Netziv that they were referring to two distinct aspects of leadership. He says there are two types of leadership. Number one, there is the person who leads the country with wisdom, or leads the area, whatever it is, and that person is called a Nasi, translated as a prince. Really, it's a leader. That's what it is, right? The Nasi. Then there's Manik Anshe Ha'olam, he says, B'inyone Elokus, the one who is able to lead people on a spiritual level, right? In terms of spirituality, in terms of belief in Hashem. And each person, he says, Ish Fa'uma B'Shem Elokot, that person who is the man of faith for whatever people we're talking about. He's talking leadership in general. There are two different aspects to leadership. Avraham Avinu, he says, had both of these aspects. And he says that when he brings a Gemara in Bava Basra at the end of Amoiches HaSfina, and the Gemara says like this: B'shah shemeis Avraham Avinu, when Avraham Avinu died, which of course is at the end of the parsha, Omdu alav b'chabura, they stood with him, so to speak, over him, b'chabura, in a group, the company, people stood there, and they said, very famous phrase, Oila olam sha'avad manhigoi, v'oila svina sha'avda kabranita. Now, these two phrases are interesting. The first one is, woe is to the world that has lost its leader, and the second one is, woe to the ship that's lost its captain. And he says these are two mashalim, and Siv says these are two parables which represent those two aspects of leadership. The leadership in terms of the manik ha'olam, leadership of this world, in terms of leadership generally, that is something difficult to obtain. The right person who is wise, a person who is a chacham, and he's also got other midas, etc., etc. But the leadership in terms of the captain of a ship, right? That is a craft. That is a craft. That is a skill. That is a melacha. It's not so much wisdom. It's umnus. It's a trade. It's a practical. Exactly. It's a skill. And therefore, he says that in one sense, generally speaking, it's much worse if the leader of the world or the leader of a country passes away. So that's much more difficult than the loss of the captain of a ship. You can find other captains, you can find other people with that skill. But he says, in one respect, it's much worse when the captain of the ship passes away. Why? Because when the leader of the world or leader, the manhig, dies, then there is only for a temporary period, things are difficult. The leader's gone. But he says, when the ship loses its captain, hasvina b'sakon, right? The ship is in danger. If the captain dies on a ship, then the ship is basically, is in danger, for mortal danger. Avraham Avinu, they lost both when he passed away. They lost the fact that he was the general leader, the manik, the chacham in that way, but also the fact in his leadership in terms of avodas Hashem. And that's why when the Bnei Ches called him and referred to him as Nasi Elokim, they were saying, you are the Nasi, you're the leader in a general sense, the manhig, the leader, but not just in wisdom, you're also Nasi Elokim in the way you lead in the name of Hashem. And I think what the Netziv is trying to express here in the concept of oila sfina of the kabranita, which is again used to this day. You've seen that phrase probably when it's often one of these phrases that's used if one of the Gedolim passes away or something, it's a woe is to the ship that's lost its captain. And the message that the Netziv is getting across is that in a spiritual sense, there is a sudden danger of the loss of spiritual leadership. If there's a vacuum in spiritual leadership, if the spiritual leadership is not there, if in Ruchnius a leader's gone, even if it's only temporary, there is a danger. There's a risk to the ship. That cannot be left. That void cannot be left because it's risky. We don't have that leadership, and we don't know what to do. We don't know where to place ourselves. And that's what happens when Avraham Avinu leaves this world. Of course, that gap will be filled in his case by Yitzchak.
Presumably, the Neches only just met.
Yes, but they knew his reputation. That was the point. Avraham Avinu, of course, had been around quite a bit by this time, and clearly his reputation had spread amongst the.
Reputation
preceded him, absolutely, clearly. I mean, you see that. Like they treat him with tremendous respect. Well, but which is an interesting thing itself in the dynamic of Avraham and his neighbors and who.
Someone within
right? Someone who didn't respect him, or just
someone that had already seen, had been touched by him, or
yes. Well, we'll come on to that in a second, actually. There's another little bit about that. We'll come on to that in a second about the immediate sphere of influence. If you look at Perek Chof Posuk Aleph, there are two explanations for in the Kliyakar. If you've got the cross coders, this is in the Kliyakar. This is in there. Perek Chof Posuk Aleph. So going on to the next parsha. Avram Zokein Bo Bayomim. So the Bo Bayomim, and this is Vashem Berachas Avram Bakol. There are lots of explanations what Bakol means, what does it mean blessed, everything, etc. Yeah. Now it says Bo Bayomim is a very difficult phrase to understand. Why? So the Kliyakar says because Bo Bayomim, they've come in days is difficult because we've already been told. We've already told at the beginning of Parshas Chayei, right? And this is difficult. He says. One second. Let me just find the bit I wanted to show you. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's really the last two. We're not going to go through the whole thing. But as I said, the problem is because it says it already earlier on. So what is being added here? That they have. It says Ramazokim. Why here is what is that being added here? So and the Kliyakar says. It's the second last paragraph. And that which it says Bo Bayomim. It should have really said he had left. He had left his days. It wasn't Bo Bayomim. He says like this: the middle with those who are Rishoim, those who are wicked, is that the best days are the days of their youth. They're like the days of clarity. Everything's great. Everything is about the physicality of this world, the physical body, and therefore the days of the youth, that's when they can enjoy everything. It's like nighttime. The elderly, when they get older, it's like they've reached nighttime. The world's gone dark. They're not going to be able to taste all of that honey on the end of the staff, quoting from let's say for Shmuel, I think, right? Whatever, they're not going to be able to get there. They can't enjoy things anymore. And it's like the early days were good. It's like you're going from day to night. With the righteous, it's the other way around. It's the entire opposite. They go from the night to the day. Because the days when they're elderly, that is they're able to really consolidate and appreciate what they've gained, learned, wisdom, everything else. Don't say the early days were better than what we have now, because it's not true. That's not a wise thing to say. Because one who says that is not particular about chokhmah. He says but tzadikim bo bayomim leziknusam. So with tzadikim it says they have bo bayomim. They have come into their days. Yeah, not yotzam and ayomim. They've come into their days. It's a beautiful perspective on old age, right? Avraham Avinu reaches old age and he doesn't decline. On the contrary, he's the pinnacle. He's the top. He's the, he's reached he's reached it, and he's now Bo Bayomim. He's now come into his element. He's now come into his days. So often we go through life with that perspective, as if like life is like, sort of declines. No, on the contrary, that's not how the Torah views it. On the contrary, that's the time to really consolidate everything in one's life. He's Bo Bayomim. Another pshat, he says, the second explanation of Kliyok is V'yesh omrim lekach is Bo Bayomim, lahoras to teach shalom machmas tzar kof solov zikna. That it wasn't because of the troubles he'd had in his life that he became elderly. Sometimes trouble can make you older, right? In many ways. It was only because he actually physically became older. Hashem blessed him and everything, and he didn't have any tsar. Then he goes and talks about Eliezer, but that's another. Basically, the second pshat of the Kliyokar is that the Torah here emphasizes Bo Bayomim to say that don't think the reason why Avraham Avinu became elderly was because he had had so much difficulties and so much stress and so much troubles through his life in all the ways we have learned about him. No, he was Bo Bayomim simply because of old age. And it wasn't that he was elderly for the difficulties he'd had. It was Hashem because Hashem gave him all the brachas which he appreciated. And again, that's a second perspective, I think, on old age from Avraham Avinu. The first one is that that tzaddikim look at their lives as if they come into their days the older they are, right? That's the first perspective. And the second perspective is they are able to reach a level where instead of looking back on everything they've been through, saying, if only I had done X, Y, Z, they're able to understand that Hashem berachas Avraham bakol. They appreciate the brachas they have, not the regrets, or at least if there is regrets, it should spur on to do the best that they can with their days. These are very important messages. The Karamat Tzvi says on Parshas Daled Posuk Gimel, which comes onto the point. So just a few psukim later, yes, this comes onto the point that Daniel mentioned before. Karamat Tzvi Hashferber, very often, he was the Rav in Soho. Yeah. Anyway, so he, I believe so. So you often find in his Pirush on Al Torah that he has a sort of quite, strong words to say about, the members of his flock to pull their socks up a little bit, and he's sometimes quite forceful in that regard. And this is one of those cases. He says, the pasuk says that Avraham Avinu says to Eliezer, you're not allowed to go after the Bnei Saknani, right? And he says, why are these words there? They seem to be superfluous. You just say Bnei Saknani. What does it mean that I dwell amongst them? So he says like this: sometimes you have someone who is a Rosha, and he goes however he wants, right? And he doesn't know anything about the way of Hashem, right? And no one has ever told him how to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how to fulfill the mitzvahs of Hashem. And he says everything he does, just has no knowledge. Just like we call nowadays a tinoik shenishba. Doesn't know any better. But he says, if you live somewhere and there is a tzaddik there who is Moira Derech Hashem, that's what he says. You live in a place where there is someone who can tell you the right thing to do. And he can show the right path, how to treat others, how to conduct oneself with Hashem. And even so, he says, the person is Yatim Ozno Mishmer Toras Chaim. He closes his ears from listening to Toras Chaim. And he carries on in a similar vein. He doesn't listen to rebuke, etc., etc. Then he says he's called a Rosha. That person is called a Rosha. And he brings the Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara in Brachas says the Bnei Masa Machasya. They were a place called Machasya. It comes quite often in the Gemara. Abire Leivninhu. They had almost like thick hearts. They weren't listening. The Kochozu Yukara Deiraisa Trei Zimni Bashata. The Gemara says they saw the honor that was given to the Torah twice a year in Adar and Elul. That was the time when they saw great covet given to the Torah, presumably because of the preparations for Pesach and for Yom Nerom. So because below Komagaya Giura Minaihu, right? And no one was Magaya. Even the Bnei talking about those who were Jewish, and they didn't sign up. He saw tremendous respect to the Torah, and no one was converted to the cause. So he says that's what it means when it says lo sik. That's what it means when it says asher anochi yeshu b'kirbo. He says even though I am amongst them, and ubechol ze odom barisha, and they're still in the same wicked pathway, and they're not interested in listening to what I'm telling them. Okay, even so, they're not. They still don't listen. So the interesting thing is that this highlights in a way that you would expect there to be even more influence Avraham Avinu would have on those who were closest to him. And he says, no, those ones are still not good. They're still not listening. I mean, you could also learn it, of course. It could be that he says this, Okay, now he goes on to say that even though they were also Rishoyim where he was going to, but nevertheless they could be influenced, whereas the Canaanim had their own problems. You could also say that maybe he was saying to him that even though they've come under Avraham Avinu's influence, they're still not good enough. They're still not good enough for Yitzchak. By the way, that's how he understands the significance of the fact that those who were closest to Avraham Avinu. And finally, the final. Yeah, of course, there were specific reasons why the Bnei Saknani were not appropriate. But he's highlighting the fact that there is less excuse. There are less excuse. Avraham Avinu is highlighting those who live near him. Those who live near him are less excuse to do what they would do. And the final idea, the final point, is a piece from the Toras Moshe. Toras Moshe says, I don't think I've got it here, but I'll tell you what he says. He says at the end of the parsha, it's a very brief idea. Moshe Feinstein says like this, that we only find, it's a very unusual phrase that's used when Avraham Avinu dies, right? Chofei Posek Zayin. Ve'ele yumei shnei chayei Avraham asher choy. That phrase, asher choy, is an unusual phrase. Normally it says, these are the years that he lived, and then it tells you the years, right? It's interesting, the word asher choy, I think, is used in the context of Odom Harishon. So you have to find a different reason and understand why that's used there. But here, Rav Moshe says that the message of Asher Chai is that through what he achieved through the latter years of his life, once he came to recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it turned all of his life, even the first, whatever it was, 75 years effectively, into life as well. So the final reflection, very powerful idea, the final reflection of Avraham Avinu's life is, recall, now he's not like Yitzchak and not like Yaakov, because he spends the first, what we would consider a lifetime, right? Not in that place of being Avraham Avinu, right? He gets there much later on, right? It arrives only when he's at the age, am I right? 75, 75 years old. So the first part of his life, he's not on that, in that position. Yes, there's a discussion when exactly he comes to recognize Hashem. Okay, that's a different question. But the fact is he doesn't arrive in the mission, doesn't arrive in Eretz Yisrael until he's 75 years old. And nevertheless, because of what he does, he turns his entire life, Asher Choy, into a life. And the message from that is that sometimes we can look back on periods of our lives and say, I messed up that, or I didn't do that so well. I only realized later on in life what I could have done, or what I should be doing, whatever. So the message of Avraham Avinu's life is Avraham Avinu managed to do that, and managed to turn all those years into years of life because of what he managed to achieve later on, which I think is a very powerful and inspirational message. Okay, I think that's enough to be getting on with for now. Have a good Shabbos. Thanks all for joining.
Good Shabbos. Thank you.
Good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Good Shabbos.